In the summer heat of 1910, the small rural community of Slocum, Texas, seemed quiet on the surface. Families tended their land, children played along dusty roads, and neighbors greeted one another in passing. But beneath that calm exterior, an undercurrent of tension was growing, one rooted in fear, resentment, and a dangerous false narrative. What happened next would shatter lives, erase a thriving community, and be buried under silence for over a century. This is the story of the Slocum Massacre, a tragedy driven by prejudice and misinformation, where dozens of innocent men, women, and children were violently killed simply for living, working, and succeeding in their own community. The violence was swift, coordinated, and devastating. Survivors were left with nothing but the clothes on their backs, forced to flee into the woods and swamps, carrying memories that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. For decades, the story of Slocum was absent from textbooks, court records, and official histories. Instead of justice, there was denial. Instead of truth, there was silence. Generations grew up never knowing this dark chapter of American history. It was not until much later that researchers, descendants, and local historians began piecing together the events, determined to give a voice to those who were silenced. Why is it important to revisit this story now? Because history is more than a list of dates and events. It is about people, about communities, about the struggles and triumphs that shape our present. By uncovering the truth, we not only honor the memory of those who were lost, but also learn to recognize the warning signs of hatred and division before they can take root again. The Slocum Massacre is not just a forgotten tragedy. It is a reminder of the power of fear, the consequences of unchecked prejudice, and the resilience of those who fight to be remembered. In this video, we will explore what life was like in Slocum before the massacre, what ignited the violence, and how the survivors endured. We will share powerful first-hand accounts passed down through generations, and we will examine how this event fits into a larger pattern of racial violence across the United States. Most importantly, we will reflect on what it means for us today and how remembering the past is a step toward building a better future. If you believe in the importance of telling stories that history tried to erase, in giving voice to the voiceless, and in learning lessons that can protect future generations, then you are in the right place. Make sure to like this video, share it so others can learn, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that uncover the hidden truths of our past. Every click, every share, helps keep these stories alive and ensures that they will never be forgotten again. Before the tragedy that would forever change Slocum, the community was a place of quiet determination and steady progress. In the rolling fields and shaded roads of East Texas, black families were cultivating not just crops, but lives filled with dignity, ambition, and hope. They had endured hardships, faced obstacles at every turn, yet their resilience had taken root in the soil they farmed and in the homes they built with their own hands. It was here, among the pine trees and fertile land, that a dream of stability was beginning to take shape. Many of these families had acquired land through years of careful saving and hard work. Each acre was a testament to their commitment to independence, a shield against the uncertainty of relying on others for survival. They grew corn, cotton, and vegetables, raising livestock to feed their families and sell at market. The rhythms of planting and harvest were more than just a way to make a living. They were a way to carve out a place in a world that often tried to deny them one. Alongside the farms, small businesses began to take root. There were general stores stocked with tools, clothes, and everyday goods. Skilled tradesmen offered services as blacksmiths, carpenters, and masons. A few enterprising individuals even managed to establish small-scale enterprises that served the wider county. These businesses were more than just sources of income. They were gathering places where news was exchanged. Friendships formed, and a sense of shared purpose grew stronger. In church halls and schoolhouses, the community invested in the education of their children, knowing that knowledge could open doors that prejudice tried to keep shut. The progress in Slocum did not happen overnight. It was the result of generations passing down lessons in persistence and self-reliance. Every freshly painted fence, every repaired roof, every cleared field was a small victory against the forces that sought to keep them from advancing. Life was far from easy, but there was pride in the fact that their livelihoods were built by their own hands. Without having to depend on the mercy of others, families dreamed of expanding their farms, sending their children to higher schools, and securing their place in the fabric of the region's economy. But with each step forward, shadows of resentment grew longer beyond the edges of their land. In neighboring areas, some white residents saw the success of Slocum's black farmers and merchants not as a sign of shared prosperity, but as a threat to the social order they had long taken for granted. The more the community thrived, the more it challenged deeply entrenched beliefs about who could own land, who could succeed, and who could have a voice in shaping the future. The achievements of Slocum's black residents were living proof that hard work and determination could overcome the limitations imposed by society. And for some, that truth was intolerable. Despite the undercurrents of tension, the people of Slocum pressed on. They continued to farm their land and grow their businesses, keeping their focus on building better lives for themselves and their children. They tended their crops with care, knowing that each harvest meant more than just food. It meant progress. It meant security. It meant the ability to stand tall in a world that often tried to push them down. In the evenings, after long days of labor, families gathered on porches to share stories, laughter, and plans for the future. Neighbors helped one another with barn raisings, shared tools when needed, and looked after each other's children. This network of mutual support strengthened their ability to withstand whatever challenges might come their way. There was a quiet confidence in Slocum during those years before the violence. The land was rich, the work was steady, and the bonds between neighbors were strong. The people believed that if they continued to work hard, invest in their land, and teach their children the values of honesty, respect, and perseverance, they could build a lasting legacy. They did not know that this very success, this hopeful striving for a better tomorrow, would soon become a target. They could not have imagined that the same fields they tended with such care would become places of terror, or that the homes they built with pride would one day be left behind in desperate flight. The story of Slocum before the massacre is not just a backdrop to tragedy, it is the heart of what was lost. These were people living the promise of what America could be. A place where freedom meant the right to work your land, to raise your children in safety, to build a business, and to see the fruits of your labor belong to you. They were not perfect, and life was never without struggle, but they had built something meaningful and real. Their farms and shops stood as proof that with determination, it was possible to create a community where opportunity was not a dream but a daily reality. It is important to remember that before the violence came the vision. The people of Slocum had laid the foundation for a future that could have inspired generations. Their story before the massacre is one of ambition and achievement, of neighbors standing together in the face of hardship, and of a community carving out a space where they could live with pride. It was this vision, a vision built in fields, in shops, in classrooms, and in hearts, that made Slocum a place of hope. And it was this same vision that those who resented their progress would try to destroy. The success that was steadily taking root in Slocum did not exist in a vacuum. It was growing in the shadow of a society shaped by laws and unwritten rules that constantly reminded black citizens of their supposed place. Across Texas and the broader South, the era of Jim Crow was in full force, with its rigid codes dictating where people could live, work, and even sit in public. These laws were not merely words on paper. They were enforced through social pressure, intimidation, and the ever-present threat of violence. Even in moments of peace, the weight of these restrictions was felt in every interaction, a silent boundary line that could never be crossed without consequence. In Slocum, the people had managed to carve out a measure of independence in spite of these barriers, but that very independence made them stand out in ways that did not go unnoticed. While the black residents of Slocum were plowing their fields, opening shops, and building homes, some white neighbors looked on with a mix of disbelief and resentment. For generations, the prevailing narrative had been that progress for one group could only come at the expense of another. The sight of black farmers owning productive land, selling their goods, and keeping pace with or even surpassing their white counterparts in certain trades was unsettling to those who believed their social status was unshakable. This was not a jealousy born of petty competition, it was deeper, tied to fears of losing control over a social order that had existed for centuries. The more self-sufficient and prosperous the black community became, the more it chipped away at a system built on inequality. Economic jealousy is a powerful and dangerous thing. It festers in whispers, in sidelong glances, in conversations held behind closed doors. It grows when people convince themselves that another's success is somehow a threat to their own security. In Slocum, that jealousy did not remain private for long. It found expression in subtle acts meant to undermine the progress being made: unfair prices at trading posts, biased lending practices, and efforts to block black farmers from accessing certain markets. Each obstacle was intended to remind them that no matter how much they worked, there would always be those determined to keep them in a lesser position. Yet, the people of Slocum pressed forward, refusing to be defined by the limitations others tried to impose. Their farms still produced, their shops still sold goods, and their families still dreamed of a better future. But to those watching from the outside, every new fence post driven into the ground, every freshly painted storefront, was seen not as a sign of mutual prosperity but as an unwelcome challenge. It fueled conversations steeped in suspicion and fear, and those fears were magnified by the larger forces at play in the country. The Jim Crow system had created an environment where suspicion of black success was not only tolerated but reinforced by law and tradition. This environment made it easier for false rumors to take hold, for exaggerated stories to spread, and for people to justify actions they might never have considered in a different context. The volatile mix of systemic racism and economic jealousy was like dry timber stacked in the sun waiting only for a spark. That spark could come in the form of a rumor about an insult, a misunderstanding in a business deal, or an entirely fabricated story designed to inflame emotions. In places like Slocum, where the progress of one community challenged the supremacy of another, it did not take much for fear and resentment to ignite into something far more dangerous, and once that fire began, it was not easily contained. Living under such conditions meant that the black residents of Slocum were constantly navigating a careful balance. They worked to grow their prosperity without drawing too much attention, to stand tall without appearing to challenge the established order. But prosperity is not something easily hidden. Land ownership and thriving businesses were visible signs of success. And success itself was enough to make some people feel as though the old world they knew was slipping away. In that tension between a community striving for a better life and a society unwilling to accept that progress lay the seeds of the tragedy to come, it is important to understand that the events that would later unfold in Slocum did not happen in isolation. Nor were they the result of a single incident. They were the culmination of years of suppressed hostility, nurtured by laws that devalued black lives and by social norms that encouraged division rather than cooperation. The Jim Crow system had built walls between communities, but in Slocum, the success of black residents had begun to chip away at those walls, creating cracks through which a different future might have emerged. For those invested in maintaining the status quo, Those cracks were unacceptable. And so, in the weeks and months leading up to that fateful summer of 1910, the atmosphere grew heavier. Conversations in town carried an edge. Certain neighbors became more distant, their greetings less warm. Whispers of trouble ahead circulated quietly but steadily, and though many hoped it was just talk, the feeling of unease was difficult to ignore. In retrospect, these were warning signs that the balance that had allowed Slocum to exist in relative peace was becoming unstable. The combination of systemic oppression and personal resentment had created a pressure that would soon explode, sweeping away not just property and livelihoods, but the fragile sense of security the community had worked so hard to build. As the tension in Slocum quietly built, it only needed the right spark to set it ablaze. And that spark came in the form of words careless to some, deliberate to others, but all carrying the power to destroy. In the weeks leading up to the tragedy, whispers began to circulate through the white community. Whispers claiming that the black residents of Slocum were preparing to rise up against their white neighbors. There was no evidence, no credible source, not even the faintest truth behind it. Yet the story spread as though it had been carved into stone, in a place already primed with economic jealousy, racial prejudice, and a deeply ingrained fear of change. Such rumors were not just idle talk, they were tinder, dry and waiting for the match. The supposed threat was vague, shifting with each retelling. In one version, there were claims of armed men gathering in secret. In another, talk of a meeting to plan attacks. Some said weapons had been hidden. Others insisted certain families had been targeted for revenge. The details did not matter. What mattered was that the seed of fear had been planted. And fear has a way of growing fast when nourished by bias. The story leapt from one conversation to the next, carried along by men in saloons, women at markets, and passers-by at country stores. It was repeated so often and with such conviction that before long, many took it as fact. In a just world, such rumors would have been dismissed or at least investigated with care. But Slocum in 1910 was not a place where black residents could expect fairness from those in positions of authority. Some local officials, rather than quelling the fear, fed into it, whether through personal prejudice, a desire to maintain their own standing, or an unwillingness to challenge the dominant narrative. They allowed the falsehoods to spread unchecked. In some cases, they amplified the claims themselves, speaking of credible threats and urging precaution. To the people hearing these words, the message was clear. If the sheriff or other leaders believed there was danger, then danger must indeed be real. The complicity of these figures gave the rumors a dangerous legitimacy. What had started as idle gossip now carried the weight of supposed official knowledge. The fear transformed into something more tangible, an expectation of conflict, a readiness for violence. Some white residents began quietly gathering weapons, while others formed loose groups to watch for trouble. They told themselves they were preparing to defend their community, but in reality, they were preparing to destroy another. For the black residents of Slocum, life continued much as before, though they could feel the change in the air. Greetings that had once been exchanged without thought were now edged with suspicion or absent altogether. People they had traded with for years suddenly looked at them differently. Conversations were cut short, and doors seemed to close more quickly. Few understood the source of this shift, and fewer still guessed the scale of the danger it heralded. The idea of a black uprising was not new in the South. It had been a recurring myth for decades, often resurfacing when a black community began to gain too much economic or social ground. Such stories played into the deepest fears of white supremacy, offering an easy excuse for preemptive violence. The narrative followed a predictable pattern: claim a threat, spread the claim widely, and act as though any aggression in response was simply self-defense. In Slocum, this well-worn script unfolded with chilling precision. The rumors took on a life of their own, growing more dramatic with each telling. Soon, it was not just a handful of individuals allegedly involved, but nearly the entire black community painted as part of the conspiracy. The absurdity of such a claim that neighbors who had lived and worked alongside white residents for years would suddenly turn against them was lost in the rush of fear and anger. Reason gave way to emotion. And emotion, unchecked, became a weapon. By the time the summer sun rose high over the fields, the stage had been set. Conversations in white households turned to talk of striking first before it was too late. The pretense of defense masked the truth. The rumors had provided the perfect justification for an act that had been simmering beneath the surface for months. Perhaps years. Economic jealousy, systemic racism, and now the specter of an imagined rebellion had woven together into a single, dangerous narrative. The tragic irony is that the black community of Slocum was not preparing for violence. They were tending their crops, repairing their homes, running their businesses, and making plans for their children's futures. They were building, not plotting. Yet in the minds of those who had allowed fear to eclipse truth, every hammer strike on a new barn, every sale made at market, every gathering for worship became another piece of evidence that something was being planned in secret. And so the lies hardened into conviction. What began as nothing more than rumor had been repeated enough, validated enough, and twisted enough that it no longer needed proof. In the minds of those who believed it, the uprising was real, and in a world shaped by prejudice, belief was all that mattered. What happened next would shatter not just the lives of those in Slocum, but the very memory of the place, leaving behind silence that would last for generations. The rumor, once a whisper, would soon explode into violence, and the truth that there had never been a threat would be buried alongside the victims. It began with something so small that, in another time and place, it might have been forgotten within days. A disagreement over a business transaction. In a community like Slocum, where neighbors often traded goods, services, and favors, disputes were not uncommon. But this particular disagreement involved a black man doing business with a white counterpart. And in the tense climate of 1910 Slocum, every interaction between the two communities carried more weight than it should have. The details of what was said and done were soon blurred, reshaped by retellings that reflected more prejudice than fact. What might have been resolved quietly in a fair and just society became something far more dangerous when filtered through the simmering resentment and suspicion that had been building for months. The argument, perhaps over payment, perhaps over a delivery, spread quickly through the white community, whispered about in homes and repeated in local gathering places. At first, it was simply described as a quarrel, but with each telling, the story gained new layers. The black man was said to have spoken out of turn, to have been disrespectful, to have made threats. No one could agree on the exact words, yet the absence of clarity only made it easier for imaginations to run wild. By the time the story reached certain ears, it was no longer a disagreement at all. It had been transformed into a deliberate act of provocation, a challenge to the social order. In a place already primed by rumors of an impending uprising, the business dispute became the perfect hook for those eager to believe that danger was close at hand. People who had once dismissed talk of rebellion now pointed to the incident as proof that the black residents of Slocum were becoming emboldened, that they no longer knew their place. For those who wanted justification for their resentment, the dispute was a gift. It allowed them to frame their prejudice as caution, to claim they were not driven by hate but by a need to protect their way of life. Local officials, instead of calming the situation, allowed the tension to rise. Some repeated the most inflammatory version of the story without verifying it, while others simply remained silent, letting the rumor take root. Silence, in this case, spoke louder than any reassurance could have. It signaled to the white residents that their fears were valid, and to the black residents that something was shifting in a dangerous direction. Trust, already fragile, began to fracture completely. As the tale grew, so did the hostility. Small acts of everyday interaction became charged with suspicion. A black man entering a store might feel the weight of stares that had not been there before. A woman carrying produce to sell at market might notice fewer customers stopping by. Conversations between neighbors who had known each other for years were now brief, awkward, and strained. The business dispute had become more than an isolated disagreement. It was now a symbol, twisted into evidence of a larger, imaginary conspiracy. It was not the first time in American history that an ordinary conflict between individuals was magnified into a racial crisis. Across the South, such moments often served as the spark for larger acts of violence, particularly when they reinforced pre-existing fears. In Slocum, this minor dispute, combined with the ongoing rumors of rebellion, became the final thread woven into a narrative that painted the entire black community as a threat. The fact that no uprising was planned, no coordinated act of aggression even considered, no longer mattered. The story had outgrown the truth. The irony was that the black residents of Slocum, far from plotting any form of resistance, were deeply invested in stability. Their livelihoods depended on steady trade, on peaceful relationships, on the ability to work their land without interference. A real uprising would have destroyed everything they had built. Yet in the minds of those gripped by fear and jealousy, reason had no place. The more improbable the threat, the more certain some people seemed to be of its reality. Soon, the dispute became a constant point of reference in conversations among white residents. It was cited as the moment when things began to turn, the proof that action was needed before it was too late. The fact that the incident had been inflated beyond recognition did not matter. In a climate already poisoned by systemic racism and economic resentment, this was all it took to tip the balance from unease to outright hostility. What happened next would follow a grim and familiar pattern. Once the decision was made, whether openly stated or silently understood, that the black community posed a danger, the idea of preemptive violence no longer seemed unthinkable to those willing to commit it. The dispute, the rumors, the simmering jealousy, all of it merged into a single justification. In their minds, they were not planning an unprovoked attack. They were preparing to defend themselves. That this defense meant targeting neighbors who had done nothing wrong, who had no part in any alleged threat, was ignored or excused. And so, what began as a simple disagreement between two men was transformed into a rallying cry. It became the piece of evidence that some had been waiting for, the proof that allowed prejudice to masquerade as vigilance. The tragedy of Slocum was not inevitable, but once the dispute was twisted into something it was not, and allowed to fuel the growing hysteria, the path toward violence became frighteningly clear. In the end, the truth of that business quarrel was lost, buried under layers of fear, falsehood, and the willful blindness of those who chose to see it not as an isolated moment, but as a justification for what they were about to unleash. The morning of July 29, 1910, began like so many summer days in Slocum, with the sun climbing over the tree line, casting long golden streaks across the fields, and the air heavy with the scent of grass warmed by the heat. For the black residents, it was a day meant for tending to crops, repairing fences, or bringing goods into town, a day like any other, filled with the quiet rhythm of work and the hope of progress. But beneath the calm surface, forces were already in motion, forces that had been gathering for weeks through rumor, resentment, and carefully fed lies. By the time the sun was high, those forces would erupt into something that would shatter the town and erase an entire community from its place in history. It happened without warning. Groups of armed white men, some on horseback and others on foot, moved in from different directions, their presence sudden and overwhelming. They were not there to talk, Not there to investigate, not there to listen. They came with rifles, shotguns, and pistols, and the certainty born of prejudice and fear that their cause was justified. There was no declaration, no attempt to seek out specific individuals accused of wrongdoing. The targets were not chosen for anything they had done, but for who they were. The first shots rang out in the stillness, and the sound carried across the countryside, echoing off the trees and barns. Panic spread as fast as the gunfire. Men who had been working in fields were struck down where they stood, some never even seeing where the shots came from. Women fled with children in their arms, seeking shelter in nearby woods or trying to reach the homes of relatives, only to find that no place was safe. Doors that might have opened in friendship in years past now stayed shut, their occupants too afraid or too complicit to offer help. The attackers moved through the community with deliberate destruction, setting fire to homes that had been built with years of hard work, burning away not just shelter, but the proof of a life earned through perseverance. The smell of smoke mixed with the sharp tang of gunpowder, the air thick and choking. Some houses were emptied before they were set alight, the contents smashed or stolen, while others were torched with everything still inside: furniture, clothing, tools, and the precious keepsakes that marked a family's history. The violence spared no one. Elderly men and women who had once been respected for their wisdom were cut down. Young men who had been the pride of their families for their skill in farming or craftsmanship fell under the hail of bullets. Mothers shielded their children as best they could, but in too many cases, their arms were no protection against the relentless force of the mob. The fields, which only hours earlier had promised a season's harvest, became a place of horror, littered with the fallen. What made the attack so devastating was its sheer speed and coordination. The mobs had come prepared, not in the sense of responding to any actual threat, but in the way one prepares for an assault they intend to carry out regardless of facts. They had chosen their day, gathered their numbers, and moved with the precision of men who knew their actions would go unpunished. In that moment, the law in Slocum belonged not to the courts or to justice, but to the guns in the hands of the attackers. For those who survived, escape was the only option. Families fled into the dense woods, some wading through creeks to cover their tracks, others moving under the cover of night toward distant towns where they hoped to find refuge. They left behind their homes, their possessions, their animals, everything that had tied them to Slocum for generations. The terror was so complete that many would never return, leaving behind empty land and silent roads where laughter and conversation had once filled the air. In the immediate aftermath, the attackers did not hide what they had done. They spoke openly about taking care of the problem, convinced that their actions had been necessary. The local authorities, rather than seeking justice for the dead, seemed to accept the story that had been built in the weeks before that the massacre had been a preemptive measure against a threat that never existed. In the absence of accountability, the truth was allowed to sink beneath the weight of lies. The silence that followed was almost as destructive as the violence itself. Without official records or widespread coverage, the story of what happened in Slocum faded from public view. The survivors carried the memory, but speaking of it was dangerous, and so it became a history whispered only in trusted company. Generations grew up not knowing why their grandparents had been forced to flee, why the land that once held thriving farms was left to grow wild. That day, July 29th, was not just the collapse of a community, it was the erasure of its legacy. The businesses, the farms, the churches, and the schools that had been built through hard work and hope were gone in a matter of hours. More than lives were lost. A piece of history was stolen, replaced by the false narrative that the violence had been warranted. And yet, beneath the silence, the truth endured, carried in the stories of those who refused to let it be forgotten, waiting for the day it would be spoken aloud again. as the flames consumed homes and gunfire echoed across the fields. The people of Slocum faced a choice between life and everything they had worked so hard to build. And in that moment, every family was thrust into a struggle that tested the limits of human courage and endurance. The woods surrounding the town became a refuge, though hardly a safe one. Families fled barefoot through underbrush and thorns, children crying in terror while mothers clutched them tightly, praying that the next step would not be the one that ended everything. Fathers carried what little they could, often leaving behind years of accumulated possessions that represented their labor and hope, because survival demanded speed, not careful packing. Each snap of a twig, each distant shout of the attackers, sent hearts racing and forced families deeper into the forest, where the shadows of trees offered concealment but no comfort. In the swamps and marshes that bordered Slocum, desperate families submerged themselves in murky water, holding children above their heads while trying to stay silent. Every sound became magnified: the distant crack of a rifle, the rustle of leaves, the hurried whispers of other frightened souls. Parents would shush children with trembling hands, their own voices barely audible. Knowing that a single sound could betray them, some families clung together for days, moving only when the cover of darkness allowed them to put more distance between themselves and the violence that had overtaken their community. Hunger, exhaustion, and fear became constant companions. Yet the drive to protect each other and preserve their dignity gave them a resilience that defied the horror around them. Among the most poignant moments were those when survivors risked their lives to retrieve what they considered sacred or essential. One story tells of a woman named Sarah, who, as her home was engulfed in flames, realized that the family Bible, the repository of faith, memory, and legacy, was still inside. Against the urging of her frightened children, she dashed into the smoke-filled house, dodging collapsing beams and the relentless heat, and emerged with the Bible clutched tightly to her chest. That single act, a small yet profound assertion of identity and continuity, symbolized the determination of countless individuals who refused to let the attackers erase the history and spirit of their families entirely. The journey through woods and swamps was not just a physical trial but an emotional ordeal, as parents made impossible decisions in split-second moments. Sometimes, the path to survival meant leaving behind pets, personal treasures, or even the homes where children had been born. Yet these losses, though devastating, could not outweigh the imperative to live. Stories passed down through generations recount whispered advice shared among fleeing neighbors. Keep moving, do not look back, hold your children close, and keep faith in your heart. In these whispered urgencies lay the collective wisdom of those who had endured unimaginable terror. Children who survived these harrowing experiences carried memories that would shape the rest of their lives. They learned to navigate the natural landscape with a skill born of necessity, to recognize which paths offered concealment and which were likely to expose them to danger. They absorbed the fear, yes, but also the courage of their parents, learning that survival sometimes demanded both calm calculation and the willingness to take risks. For many, these early experiences of running, hiding, and enduring formed a psychological landscape as vivid as any memory of home before the massacre. And it would remain with them forever. Even as families struggled to protect themselves, the community's social fabric was tested in new ways. Strangers became allies in the woods, sharing knowledge of the terrain, offering food and water scavenged from nature, and lending quiet encouragement. Moments of shared humanity emerged amid the chaos. Small gestures of solidarity that preserved hope and reinforced the notion that, despite the horrors inflicted upon them, they were not entirely alone. These acts of bravery and kindness, often small, sometimes almost invisible, became lifelines that allowed families to endure the days and nights of uncertainty. As time passed, the survivors had to reconcile the loss of material possessions with the preservation of life and memory. The family Bible, photographs hastily tucked into pockets, and other small mementos became symbols of resilience and continuity, tangible proof that despite the destruction, their stories were not entirely lost. Oral histories flourished in the safety of distant towns and hiding places, as survivors recounted events to one another, recording experiences in whispered recollections that would eventually form the backbone of collective memory. The tales of those who had risked everything to save sacred items or protect their children became central narratives, passed down so that future generations would not forget what had been taken from them, nor the courage that had carried them through. Even decades later, descendants recount these heart-wrenching stories, often with tears and a mixture of awe and sorrow, recognizing that the woods, the swamps, and the hidden paths of Slocum became more than mere terrain. They were the stage upon which ordinary families demonstrated extraordinary bravery. The narrative of fleeing, hiding, and salvaging what little they could preserve serves not only as a record of the horrors endured, but as a testament to human endurance and the deep bond of family and community in the face of overwhelming adversity. In remembering these stories, the courage and tenacity of those who survived are kept alive, reminding us that even in the darkest hours, hope, faith, and the will to protect what we hold dear can illuminate a path forward through the shadows. In the wake of the terror that had engulfed Slocum, the survivors faced a new and equally insidious threat, the stark reality that justice would not be served, that the very system designed to protect the innocent was complicit in their suffering. As families emerged from hiding, bruised, exhausted, and grieving, they found not the comforting presence of law and order, but a silence that spoke volumes. Local authorities, many of whom had either participated in or tacitly supported the violence, treated the aftermath with indifference, often blaming the victims themselves or dismissing the events as the unfortunate result of disorderly conduct. The few who attempted to document what had occurred, to gather testimony, or to seek redress quickly realized that the legal system was not their ally. Witnesses were silenced through intimidation, threats, and fear that speaking out could result in further harm or even death, leaving the courts with only fragmented accounts and a community too terrified to testify. The courts, when forced to address the events at all, reflected the entrenched biases of the era. Judges and jurors, themselves products of a society steeped in prejudice, often interpreted evidence selectively, turning a blind eye to the overwhelming brutality while accepting flimsy claims that suggested the violence had been justified. Even the most blatant acts, committed in broad daylight and witnessed by many, were shrugged off or rationalized as understandable reactions to a perceived threat. In this climate, the perpetrators moved with a freedom born of impunity. Their actions had been calculated to instill fear, and that fear extended not only to the residents of Slocum, but to anyone who might consider holding them accountable. The message sent was chillingly clear. Lives could be destroyed, communities obliterated, and the law would do nothing to intervene. Survivors, already traumatized from the massacre itself, now bore the additional weight of knowing that justice was unreachable. Their grief was compounded by the bitter knowledge that the systems meant to uphold fairness were instead tools of oppression. Families had lost homes, livelihoods, and loved ones, and yet the perpetrators walked free, some returning to their daily lives as if nothing had happened, emboldened by the lack of consequences. Stories of those who had tried to challenge this reality, residents who had dared to speak to newspapers, petition local officials, or attend court proceedings often ended in disappointment or personal danger, further reinforcing the sense of helplessness. This systemic failure extended beyond mere legal outcomes. It shaped the social and psychological landscape of the survivors, instilling a pervasive wariness and mistrust that would last for generations. Children who had witnessed the massacre grew up understanding that the rules applied unevenly, that power and prejudice could bend institutions to serve the few at the expense of the many. Adults carried forward the trauma in silence, wary of revealing the full extent of their suffering to outsiders or even to the next generation, knowing that exposure could provoke further danger or invite ridicule. The inability to secure justice was not simply a legal shortfall. It became a social reality, a shadow that lingered over every attempt to rebuild lives or reclaim lost ground. Oral histories, whispered in secret, became the repository of truth. Survivors shared their stories with those they trusted, recounting the names of neighbors lost, the homes burned, and the possessions stolen. Each narrative carried a dual purpose: to honor the memory of those destroyed, and to serve as a warning of the world that had allowed such atrocities to occur. In these private exchanges, the survivors found a measure of agency, a way to assert that their lives and experiences could not be erased, even when the official record refused to acknowledge them. The act of remembering became itself a form of resistance against the erasure enforced by both mob violence and systemic injustice. The absence of accountability had long-term consequences for the community and its descendants. Land that had been worked by black families for generations was lost, seized, or abandoned, and the economic foundations painstakingly built were obliterated, without restitution or legal recognition. The generational wealth and security that might have been passed down were denied, perpetuating cycles of poverty and marginalization. More than property was stolen, the survivors were robbed of certainty, of safety, and of faith that the institutions of governance could protect them. This absence of justice cemented a societal narrative in which black life was undervalued and vulnerable, a narrative that continued to echo in policies and attitudes long after the guns fell silent. Yet, even in the absence of formal recognition, the survivors and their descendants refused to let the truth die. Community leaders, pastors, and elders preserved what they could: letters, family Bibles, oral recollections, and local lore, each story told in hushed tones, each memory shared in private gatherings, became a testament to resilience and a subtle challenge to a society that sought to forget. These efforts underscored a profound truth: while the law may fail, memory endures. The lack of convictions did not erase the events themselves, nor did it extinguish the courage of those who survived. In remembering the massacre and the systemic injustices that followed, we confront the uncomfortable reality that history is often shaped by those in power and silenced by those who benefit from oppression. The legal failures in Slocum serve as a stark reminder of how institutions can be weaponized against the very people they are meant to protect, and how impunity can embolden future acts of violence. The stories of survivors who navigated this landscape, preserving life and memory against overwhelming odds, remind us that justice is not only measured in courts and verdicts, but also in the perseverance of truth and the determination to bear witness. Through these stories, we honor the lives lost, recognize the courage of those who survived, and understand that remembering is a vital form of justice in itself. In the aftermath of the Slocum Massacre, as survivors tried to piece together what remained of their shattered lives, they were confronted with an even more insidious force: the deliberate rewriting of history and the manipulation of public perception. Local newspapers, many of which were controlled by the same social networks that had tacitly condoned or actively participated in the violence, published accounts that distorted the truth, portraying the black residents not as victims but as provocateurs, as a community that had supposedly instigated unrest and threatened the established order. Headlines hinted at lawlessness and suggested that the ensuing violence was a regrettable but understandable response to imagined transgressions, effectively inverting the moral compass and casting the oppressed as aggressors. Families who had fled into the woods or swamps were not depicted with the dignity and resilience that their struggle deserved. Instead, they were often described with language designed to evoke suspicion, fear, or disdain, erasing the human cost of the atrocity and obscuring the profound courage it had required to survive. This systematic misrepresentation of events did more than distort immediate public opinion. It laid the groundwork for decades of silence, shaping how Slocum and its black residents were remembered or, more accurately, forgotten. For the wider public, the massacre became a footnote, if it was mentioned at all, in historical accounts of Texas or the broader American South. Educational materials. History books and scholarly studies largely omitted the events, leaving generations unaware of the magnitude of what had occurred. The absence of Slocum in mainstream narratives created a false sense of security and normalcy, as if the terror and destruction that had claimed lives, homes, and livelihoods had never existed. Children grew up learning sanitized versions of history, never hearing of the families who had been forced to flee in terror, the homes that were reduced to ashes, or the lives abruptly ended by mob violence, creating a generational gap in collective memory that allowed the injustice to fester in obscurity. Meanwhile, the survivors themselves faced the quiet burden of invisibility. Even as they rebuilt their lives, the social and cultural erasure of the massacre imposed a psychological toll. The knowledge that their suffering was neither acknowledged nor validated by the broader society deepened their trauma. They could tell their stories only in private, passing them from parent to child, often whispered around kitchen tables or in the quiet corners of churches, preserving the truth against overwhelming odds. In these private spaces, memories were nurtured and safeguarded, forming a parallel historical record that resisted the official narrative. Even as mainstream accounts painted a misleading picture, the act of remembering became a silent rebellion against societal amnesia, a declaration that their lives, their struggles, and their losses were neither insignificant nor forgettable. This calculated erasure also reinforced existing power structures, allowing perpetrators and their sympathizers to avoid accountability while cementing the social hierarchy that had fueled the massacre. By portraying black residents as troublemakers or conspirators, newspapers and community elites justified inaction and reinforced prejudice, creating a narrative in which systemic violence appeared natural or necessary. Readers, guided by these biased reports, were offered a version of events that obscured the moral responsibility of those who had orchestrated the attacks. The resulting collective memory, or lack thereof, shaped attitudes toward race, power, and justice in the region for decades, perpetuating the very fears and prejudices that had led to the tragedy in the first place. Despite the deliberate obfuscation, the truth could not be entirely silenced. Survivors, in sharing their oral histories, preserved a different narrative, one that emphasized the humanity, resilience, and courage of those who had endured unimaginable fear. Stories of mothers protecting their children, fathers guiding families through treacherous terrain, and communities huddled in swamps and woods became enduring testimonies to the human spirit. These recollections highlighted not only the horror but also the determination to survive, to honor those lost, and to resist the societal erasure that threatened to consign their lives to oblivion. Historians who later uncovered the events of Slocum found themselves confronting a dual challenge: documenting the massacre accurately while contending with a century of misinformation and omission. Archival research revealed inconsistencies, hidden records, and accounts that contradicted the official story, illuminating a pattern of racialized violence that had been conveniently ignored. This process of reclamation became an act of restorative justice, not in the legal sense, but in the moral and cultural sense, giving voice to those who had been silenced and ensuring that the massacre would not be forgotten entirely. The omission of Slocum from mainstream history serves as a powerful reminder of how narratives are controlled, and how the truth can be suppressed when it threatens existing power structures. By rewriting the story, newspapers and authorities attempted to dictate which lives were considered worthy of remembrance, and which could be erased without consequence. Yet, the resilience of memory, the courage of survivors, and the dedication of later historians challenged this imposed silence. demonstrating that the truth, though delayed, can emerge to illuminate injustice and preserve legacy. Through careful preservation of oral histories, documentation of survivor accounts, and scholarly research, the story of Slocum confronts the audience with the stark reality of what occurred, demanding recognition, empathy, and reflection. In revisiting Slocum's tragic past, we are compelled not only to acknowledge the horror that occurred, but also to reflect on the broader patterns of injustice that allowed such events to be hidden. Remembering these stories, honoring those who survived, and challenging the narratives that have long obscured the truth become acts of moral responsibility. The omission of Slocum from history teaches us the importance of vigilance, the need to confront uncomfortable truths, and the imperative to give voice to those who were once silenced. In recognizing the full scope of what happened, we honor both the victims and the resilience of those who refused to let their experiences vanish into the shadows of forgotten history. As the smoke cleared over Slocum and the echoes of gunfire faded into the oppressive heat of July 1910, the survivors faced a reality even more devastating than the immediate loss of life. The obliteration of everything they had painstakingly built, the destruction not only of homes and businesses but of dreams, security, and generational stability. For decades, Black families in Slocum had worked tirelessly to establish a life of independence and dignity through farming, small enterprises, and property ownership, investments that symbolized hope for their children and grandchildren. Every plowed field, every storefront, every deed to land was more than economic activity. It was a testament to resilience, ambition, and the pursuit of equality in a society determined to deny them both. Yet, in a single day, that foundation was shattered. Homes that had stood for years, full of memories and the laughter of children, were reduced to ashes, their walls collapsing under flames that symbolized not only physical destruction, but also the erasure of a community's achievements. Businesses that had been nurtured through sweat and long hours were looted or burned, leaving families without the modest income that had been their lifeline. The massacre did not merely eliminate physical property. It severed the thread of intergenerational wealth that these families had been cultivating, a thread that might have connected parents to children and grandchildren in a legacy of opportunity and self-sufficiency. Land that had been legally acquired and carefully tended was either abandoned in fear or seized by opportunistic neighbors, often white residents who viewed the devastation as an opportunity to expand their holdings. For the survivors who remained in the region, the loss was compounded by legal and societal structures that offered no recourse. Courts ignored claims, local officials turned a blind eye, and systemic discrimination ensured that the devastated Black families could not reclaim what had been stolen, leaving them in a perpetual state of economic precarity. The massacre thus became more than a moment of violence. It was a calculated mechanism of social and economic suppression, designed to remind the Black population of their precarious position within a white-dominated society, and to extinguish the hope embodied in their hard-won prosperity. Children who had witnessed the flames consuming their homes and the chaos of families fleeing into woods and swamps carried those images into adulthood, a psychological inheritance as tangible as the material losses they endured. The trauma shaped their aspirations, their sense of security, and their understanding of the world. Even those who attempted to rebuild faced insurmountable obstacles, from discriminatory practices that denied them fair business opportunities to social ostracism that limited community support. The massacre created an environment where progress was punished, ambition was dangerous, and survival itself required constant vigilance. Families who had once dreamed of passing down land and businesses as legacies were confronted with the harsh reality that their children would inherit only the memories of what had been destroyed, along with the financial instability imposed by centuries of systemic inequities. This economic and social devastation did not end with the immediate generation. The absence of generational wealth and property meant that descendants of the Slocum survivors were denied opportunities for education, homeownership, and capital accumulation that might have allowed them to break cycles of poverty. Each lost parcel of land, each burned home, and each looted store represented not only a personal loss but a ripple effect that hindered community development for decades. Neighborhoods that might have thrived as hubs of Black enterprise and culture instead became reminders of the fragility of success in the face of racialized violence. Social cohesion suffered as families scattered, displaced by fear and bereft of the tangible anchors that property and land provide. Communities that had worked together to cultivate prosperity and mutual support were fragmented, and the bonds that had offered protection and stability were severely weakened. The long-term economic consequences were mirrored by enduring social impacts. Trust in institutions meant to uphold justice eroded, as survivors realized that neither law enforcement nor courts would protect them, and that neighbors could become aggressors with impunity. The psychological toll compounded the material losses. Parents who had survived the massacre bore the weight of trauma while striving to shield their children from both immediate danger and the long shadow of generational instability. Community leaders who had sought to mediate or advocate were silenced by intimidation, reinforcing the perception that resistance to the social order could be met with extreme consequences. As a result, a pervasive sense of vulnerability became embedded in the collective consciousness, shaping the attitudes and behaviors of subsequent generations. Yet even amid this devastation, the survivors displayed remarkable resilience, demonstrating the capacity to preserve memory and culture in the face of systemic erasure. Families who fled into the woods and swamps, who carried with them the most precious symbols of heritage like family Bibles, not only saved their lives but safeguarded their history and identity. Oral traditions, recounting the loss of property, the heartbreak of displacement, and the courage required to endure, became a repository of knowledge and a subtle form of resistance. These stories were vital not merely for remembrance but as tools to educate future generations about the costs of injustice and the importance of resilience. The massacre and its aftermath serve as a sobering illustration of how violence can extend beyond immediate physical harm, embedding itself in the economic and social fabric of a community for decades. The destruction of property and generational wealth in Slocum was not incidental, but part of a larger pattern of suppression, where systemic racism, economic envy, and the complicity of institutions intersected to erase not only lives but legacies. By recounting these experiences, we honor the resilience of those who survived, acknowledge the scope of the losses endured, and recognize the enduring impact of historical injustices. In understanding the full consequences of Slocum, we are reminded that the fight for justice and equality encompasses more than legal redress. It requires attention to the economic, social, and cultural damages that shape lives long after the immediate events have passed. The story of Slocum thus challenges us to reflect on the enduring power of both resilience and memory, highlighting that while property and wealth can be taken, the determination to preserve history and identity remains an indomitable human force. The tragedy that befell Slocum, Texas, in July 1910 did not occur in isolation. It was one devastating chapter in a broader, deeply entrenched pattern of racial violence that swept across the United States during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, targeting prosperous Black communities that dared to flourish despite systemic oppression and societal prejudice. Across the South, and in pockets of the North, the emergence of Black economic success, education, and community organization was often met not with admiration or inclusion, but with envy, fear, and violent reprisal, creating an environment where achievement itself became a perilous act. Slocum was emblematic of this national pattern, where Black families, through diligent labor, enterprise, and community cohesion, managed to carve out spaces of relative stability and opportunity, only to see them threatened or obliterated by white mobs whose actions were fueled by a toxic mix of racial animosity, economic jealousy, and the preservation of a social hierarchy designed to keep black citizens subordinate. These attacks were not random. They were calculated efforts to enforce racial subordination and to maintain a system in which black prosperity was perceived as a direct challenge to the established order. In towns like Slocum, where families had invested years in cultivating farms, opening businesses, and acquiring property, the mere presence of success among black residents provoked suspicion and resentment. Rumors of insurrection, theft, or conspiracies, often entirely fabricated, spread rapidly through communities, inflaming passions and justifying premeditated acts of terror in the minds of aggressors. In many cases, local authorities and law enforcement either turned a blind eye to these violent acts or actively participated, further embedding a culture of impunity that allowed mobs to act with near total disregard for the law. This pattern of complicity ensured that violence could erupt with minimal consequences for perpetrators, while simultaneously signaling to black communities that their safety and legal protection were contingent upon the whims of their oppressors. The consequences of these attacks went beyond immediate physical harm. Prosperous black communities, hubs of economic vitality, culture, and social cohesion, were systematically dismantled. Their achievements erased from the landscape and, in many cases, from the historical record. Families lost home, farms, and businesses that could have provided stability and intergenerational wealth, leaving survivors to confront poverty, displacement, and the psychological trauma of witnessing such targeted destruction. In addition to the material losses, these attacks inflicted long-term social consequences, as the scattering of families and the terrorization of communities disrupted networks of mutual support. Communal governance and cultural continuity that had been painstakingly developed over decades. Schools, churches, and civic institutions that had fostered community resilience were abandoned or destroyed, and with them went the seeds of future growth. Education and empowerment. The scale and frequency of such violence also served as a warning, a chilling demonstration of the lengths to which white-dominated society would go to enforce racial hierarchies. Incidents like the Slocum Massacre echoed across the country, reinforcing an implicit social contract that black prosperity and independence could be tolerated only within strictly defined limits and under constant scrutiny. This created a climate of fear in which black families had to navigate daily life with heightened awareness of potential threats, knowing that success itself could provoke lethal hostility. Every business opened, every acre of land purchased, and every child sent to school represented both hope and risk, illustrating the precariousness of striving for advancement in a society structured to resist it. Historical records, often sanitized or deliberately omitted, obscure the true extent of these coordinated campaigns of terror, but survivor accounts, oral histories, and later scholarly research reveal a pattern that is impossible to ignore. In towns across the South, from Rosewood, Florida, to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and in countless smaller, less documented communities like Slocum, similar stories unfolded. Prosperous black neighborhoods targeted, homes and businesses burned, residents attacked or forced to flee, and perpetrators rarely held accountable. These incidents were not isolated episodes of mob violence. They were elements of a systematic strategy to maintain racial control, suppress economic competition, and assert dominance over a population whose very existence as a self-sufficient, thriving community challenged prevailing notions of white supremacy. The national scope of this violence underscores the resilience and courage of black communities, whose members continually rebuilt, resisted, and preserved their culture and legacies despite repeated attempts to erase them. Survivors of these attacks carried memories of destruction and loss, yet they maintained oral traditions, religious practices, and communal ties that safeguarded identity and history. The stories of Slocum, Rosewood, Tulsa, and other affected communities illustrate not only the magnitude of racialized violence, but also the remarkable endurance and agency of those who refused to allow these atrocities to obliterate their spirit or heritage. Understanding the Slocum Massacre within this broader context provides critical insight into the structural forces that enabled such tragedies. Economic jealousy, systemic racism, and institutional complicity were not anomalies in Slocum. They were features of a national landscape in which Black achievement was systematically undermined through intimidation, violence, and historical erasure. By connecting Slocum to other instances of targeted attacks on Black communities, we begin to recognize the cumulative effect of these events on generational wealth, social mobility, and collective memory, offering a clearer picture of the barriers that Black Americans faced and continue to confront. This larger perspective also reinforces the importance of historical reclamation and education. By acknowledging patterns of racial violence that extend beyond isolated incidents, we honor the resilience of communities that survived and recognize the systemic forces that shaped their experiences. Slocum's tragedy, situated within a nationwide phenomenon of targeted attacks on Black prosperity, serves as a compelling reminder of the ongoing need to confront history honestly, preserve survivor narratives, and ensure that the legacies of these communities are neither forgotten nor diminished. In reflecting on these patterns, we are called to examine both the historical and contemporary ramifications of racial violence, recognizing that the fight for justice and equity encompasses not only the acknowledgement of past atrocities, but also the dismantling of systemic barriers that continue to limit opportunity and security for marginalized communities. As we reflect on the tragic events that unfolded in Slocum, Texas, in July 1910, it becomes painfully clear that the massacre was not merely a local incident, but a manifestation of deeply rooted racial injustice that permeated American society at the time, and whose echoes are still felt today. Honoring the victims of Slocum is more than a symbolic gesture. It is an imperative act of remembrance that acknowledges the humanity, resilience, and dignity of those whose lives were violently cut short. Each individual lost, each family torn apart, each dream destroyed represents not just a moment in history, but a warning about the consequences of unchecked hatred. Systemic oppression and societal complicity. By remembering these lives, we preserve their stories and ensure that future generations understand the gravity of racial violence and the importance of standing against injustice in all its forms. Acknowledging the truth of Slocum requires more than recounting the events themselves. It demands a willingness to confront uncomfortable realities about the systems and attitudes that allowed such atrocities to occur. The massacre was enabled by a combination of economic jealousy, white supremacy, and legal and social structures that actively protected perpetrators while leaving survivors vulnerable and voiceless. Understanding this context helps us see that the tragedy was not an anomaly, but part of a broader pattern of racialized violence that sought to suppress Black prosperity and autonomy. Recognizing the systemic nature of such oppression is crucial, because it allows us to address the roots of inequality rather than merely its symptoms. It challenges us to examine how similar dynamics might persist today, whether in economic disparities, educational inequities, or institutional biases, and to actively work to dismantle them. Addressing systemic racism is essential if we are to prevent atrocities like Slocum from recurring. It requires not only awareness but action, implementing policies that promote equity, ensuring that all communities have access to justice, education, and economic opportunity, and creating social environments in which prejudice and fear cannot be weaponized against vulnerable populations. By confronting the structural mechanisms that perpetuate inequality, we honor the memory of those who suffered by striving to create a society in which no family will face the terror of seeing their lives and livelihoods destroyed simply because of the color of their skin. Furthermore, education plays a vital role in this process. Telling the stories of Slocum and similar events ensures that history is neither sanitized nor forgotten, providing critical lessons on the consequences of hatred, misinformation, and collective apathy. Through storytelling, commemoration, and active engagement in social justice, we cultivate empathy, awareness, and a commitment to equity that can safeguard future generations. The survivors of Slocum and their descendants exemplify resilience, courage, and the human capacity to endure even in the face of unimaginable loss. They preserved oral histories, maintained cultural traditions, and rebuilt lives despite systemic barriers and the trauma of displacement, demonstrating that memory and identity cannot be fully erased, even when physical communities are destroyed. By listening to these stories, we not only honor the past, but also recognize the strength and agency of those who lived through it, drawing inspiration for our own commitments to justice, equality, and compassion. These lessons remind us that standing against injustice is a continuous responsibility, one that involves recognizing the humanity of all people and advocating for fairness, opportunity, and dignity in every aspect of life. As we close this reflection, I want to sincerely thank you for taking the time to engage with this story, for listening to the voices that history attempted to silence, and for joining in the commitment to remember, honor, and learn. Your awareness and empathy contribute to the broader movement to ensure that tragedies like Slocum are neither repeated nor forgotten, and that the lessons they teach continue to resonate across generations. If you found value in this content, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing this story with others, so that more people can understand the significance of acknowledging historical injustices and working toward a more just and compassionate society. By keeping these narratives alive and advocating for systemic change, we honor the memory of those lost, empower the voices of survivors, and reinforce our collective responsibility to prevent such atrocities from happening again. May the courage and resilience of the Slocum community inspire us all to act with empathy, integrity, and unwavering commitment to justice. Thank you once again for watching, for remembering, and for standing with those whose stories deserve to be told. Sleep well, knowing that the act of bearing witness and sharing truth is a step toward a brighter, fairer future. Good night.